You ever stop and think about how sometimes the thing that wins is the thing nobody saw coming? Like the underdog that wasn't even supposed to be in the fight. Here's the thing. In 1967, if you showed up to a drag strip in Southern California with a Volkswagen Beetle, you weren't just the underdog, you were the punchline. Old school hot rodders would literally boo and hiss when a VW rolled to the starting line. They'd cross their arms, shake their heads, maybe spit on the ground for good measure. And then, over and over again, they'd watch that same little German car with an air-cooled four-cylinder engine absolutely embarrass their big block American iron. I'm talking about cars with Hemis and blowers and engines that cost more than some people's houses, getting walked by a bug. A Volkswagen Beetle, and not just any Beetle, a 1956 oval window model that started life as a high school kid's daily driver, weighing 1,200 pounds soaking wet, painted red with flames, running on an engine that the factory said should make 30 horsepower. Except this one was making over 200. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about drag racing history that nobody talks about anymore. If you're someone who loves underdog stories, old school gasser wars, or just cars that made absolutely no sense on paper but dominated anyway, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So here's what most people don't realize. Hot Rod Magazine runs a list called the Top 100 Most Influential Hot Rods of All Time. And when you think influential, you think of the classics, right? The cars that defined eras, Big Daddy Roth's creations, Hemi-powered wheelie machines, blown big block Corvettes, fire-breathing fuel dragsters, all the icons. Well, number 53 on that list is not any of those. It's a Volkswagen Beetle. A little red 1956 oval window bug that weighs 1,200 pounds and started life as a kid's daily driver. And when it made that list, it landed ahead of Mickey Thompson's Challenger 1, ahead of the Stone, Woods, and Cook Willys, ahead of Big John Mazmanian's Candy Apple masterpiece, ahead of Craig Breedlove's Spirit of America, a Volkswagen, ahead of all of those. Let that sink in for a second. The drag racing community in the 1960s absolutely hated this car. Not because it was dangerous or dirty or cheating, they hated it because it kept winning and there was nothing they could do about it. Over and over, at strips across Southern California, a tiny German economy car with an air-cooled four-cylinder engine would roll to the starting line and old-school hot rodders would boo and hiss, and then watch in disbelief as it took the win light away from their big block American iron. This is the story of the EMPI Inch Pincher, the most hated car in drag racing and probably the most influential Volkswagen that ever ran a quarter mile. Now, you might be thinking, how does a Volkswagen Beetle, a car designed to be cheap transportation for post-war Germany, end up becoming a drag racing legend? How does a car with a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine that sounds like an angry sewing machine compete against purpose-built American muscle? And why would anyone even try? To understand how this car happened, you have to understand one man and one moment in the early 1950s in Riverside, California. Joe Vittone. Look, Joe Vittone originally opened a Volkswagen and Porsche dealership called Econo Motors in 1954, and Joe had been a hot rodder from the start. His first car was a 1932 Ford Model B, so it's not like he grew up worshiping VWs or had some kind of cultural allegiance to German engineering. But he saw an opportunity nobody else was seeing, which was that the Beetle was selling like crazy in America. Post-war Americans wanted affordable, reliable transportation, and VW was delivering that in spades. The problem was the aftermarket parts available for it were absolutely terrible. We're talking about an era where if you wanted to modify your Volkswagen, you were ordering sketchy parts from fly-by-night suppliers who didn't stand behind their products. Joe ordered some parts from an East Coast supplier one time, and when he called to ask about the warranty, the guy told him, and I'm quoting here, "If it breaks into two pieces, you own both parts." That's it. That was the warranty. If it snaps in half, congratulations, you now have two paperweights. And that was all Joe needed to hear. He founded EMPI, European Motor Products Incorporated, on the spot, essentially, and started making quality VW parts. His very first product was a set of replaceable valve guides that solved a chronic wear problem in VW cylinder heads. Simple, useful, made right. That was the EMPI philosophy from day one. No gimmicks, no garbage, just parts that worked and didn't grenade the first time you pushed them. And that philosophy, that commitment to quality in a market flooded with junk, is what built EMPI into one of the most respected names in Volkswagen performance. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Joe's son, Daryl, was about 10 years old when his father first brought home a Beetle, and the kid fell in love with Volkswagens in a way that would define his entire life. By the time Daryl was in high school at Polytechnic in Riverside, his daily driver was a cherry red 1956 oval window Beetle that he dressed up with chrome wheels and a sports exhaust, stock 30 horsepower engine. But it was his car, and he loved it. And that specific car, that red oval window bug, would eventually become one of the most famous drag racing machines in American history, even if neither Daryl nor his father knew that yet. Here's where it gets really interesting. The car's journey toward the drag strip actually started not in California, but in the Bahamas. Joe Vittone was personal friends with Dan Gurney. He'd sold Gurney a Porsche Speedster early in his career, back when Gurney was just starting to make a name for himself in motorsports. And when the Grand Prix of Volkswagens in Nassau was announced for 1963, Joe saw a perfect marketing opportunity. He asked Gurney to drive Daryl's red Beetle. Gurney tested the car at Riverside Raceway, and in Nassau, he won. The car was essentially stock at that point. EMPI anti-roll bar, camber compensator, sports exhaust, and the factory 30 horsepower engine. Dan Gurney in a stock Volkswagen winning a race. Already a good story, right? Gurney's name alone gave the car credibility, and Joe Vittone knew that. It was brilliant marketing. They went back in 1964, when engine modifications were newly permitted, and this is where the man who would actually build the legend enters the picture. Dean Lowry had been racing Chryslers before Joe Vittone hired him at Econo Motors, and he was the kind of mechanic who understood not just how to maintain engines, but how to make them do things the factory never intended. For the 1964 Nassau race, Lowry ported and polished the cylinder heads and modified the valve springs, and Daryl's bug crossed the finish line first, then got disqualified for the illegal valve springs. Joe Vittone was furious and walked away from road racing entirely, but Dean Lowry was already thinking about something else. He built a 1700cc engine, stripped out Daryl's oval window Beetle, and took it to the drag strip. That single decision changed everything. Here's where you need to understand how the NHRA gas class system actually worked, because without that, the whole story makes no sense. Gas classes meant gasoline only. No nitromethane, no methanol. That separated these cars from the fuel classes, where top fuel and funny cars were burning nitro and making science fiction horsepower numbers. The gas classes were organized around a weight-to-displacement ratio. You took your car's total weight in pounds and divided it by your engine displacement in cubic inches, and whatever number you got put you in a class. A lighter car with a smaller engine could land in exactly the same class as a heavier car with a bigger engine. The lower gas classes, G through K gas, were specifically defined for non-supercharged four-cylinder engines, among other things, and the VW's air-cooled flat 4 fit perfectly into that structure. So the inch pincher wasn't somehow sneaking into a class it didn't belong in. It belonged there. The rules put it there. And the rules also gave it a handicap start in elimination rounds proportional to its class index, which meant that if Dean Lowry could get the little bug into third gear before his opponent's light even went green, it was already over. Picture the guy in the other lane watching this happen. He's got some American V8 he built over multiple winters, and he's staging next to a Volkswagen that already has a head start built into the system. And when the tree counts down, the bug is already moving and pulling away, and there is nothing to be done about it. This happened over and over, and you can see why people hated it, even though it was completely legal. So Dean Lowry kept developing the engine, and the development program got serious fast. Denzel cylinder heads with twin Solex carburetors pushed the car into the 13-second range. Then came a 1900cc engine with Okrasa heads and dual 48 IDA Weber carburetors. In April 1966, at the Riverside half-mile drags, Dean ran 22.04 seconds at 115.5 miles per hour over the longer distance. And the timing crew reportedly refused to believe the numbers. They ran them again. Same answer. A Volkswagen Beetle, running a half-mile in the low 22s at over 115 miles per hour. That wasn't supposed to be possible, but there it was, on the time slip in black and white. Now here's what most people don't realize about what Dean Lowry was doing. He wasn't just bolting on parts and hoping for the best. He was systematically engineering a VW engine to perform at levels the factory never dreamed of. He understood that the air-cooled flat 4 had certain advantages if you knew how to exploit them. Low weight, low center of gravity because the engine was in the back, and if you could solve the cooling issues and get enough air and fuel into the cylinders, you could make real power. The problem was that nobody had really tried before, not at this level. Dean was writing the playbook as he went. The biggest leap came when Joe Vittone and Daryl traveled to England and met the people at Speedwell and a guy named Shorrock, who was making superchargers for small displacement British cars. They came home with a Shorrock supercharger that they fitted to a 1600cc engine with a British SU carburetor. And on EMPI's own dynamometer, that combination produced 220 horsepower running straight methanol out of a Volkswagen engine. 220 horsepower from an engine that started life making 30. Think about that multiplier for a second. That's not modification, that's transformation. The car ran 12.7 seconds at 106 miles per hour at Carlsbad Raceway, which for 1966 was a number that made absolutely no sense on paper. That supercharged motor was eventually pulled out and put into something even wilder, a car called the Joustler, which was a fiberglass-bodied Beetle weighing only 500 pounds. The Joustler ended its career at Orange County International Raceway in 1968 when the rear suspension broke during a run. Driver Lee Layton walked away unhurt, but the car was done. And honestly, that's a miracle in itself. 500 pounds, supercharged engine, rear suspension failure at speed, and the driver walks away. Different era, different safety standards, different kind of bravery required. Back to the Inch Pincher itself. The 1967 rebuild is where the car became the iconic machine that ended up in Hot Rod Magazine's Top 100. NHRA revised the H-gas weight brake rules that year, and Dean Lowry responded by doing a complete transformation of what had started as Daryl's street car. The original VW torsion bar front suspension came out entirely and got replaced with a straight axle, the classic gasser conversion that every serious competitor was running, because raising the front end like that transferred weight to the rear wheels on launch and gave you dramatically better traction off the line. If you've ever seen photos of gassers from this era, that nose-high stance is the defining visual. It wasn't for looks, it was pure physics. Weight transfer equals traction equals faster elapsed times. The floor pan got rescanned in aluminum. Every steel body panel became lightweight fiberglass. The original oval rear window got cut out and replaced with a larger unit from an early 60s car. Every piece of glass became plexiglass. The car got repainted in red metal flake with flames, and the weight dropped to 1,200 pounds total, which was about 500 pounds lighter than when Daryl had been driving it to school. 500 pounds, that's the difference between a car and a missile. The BRM magnesium wheels deserve a mention here because they were another piece of the EMPI international connection story. Joe Vittone had established a relationship with Tony Rudd at British Racing Motors during that 1963 England trip, and through that connection, the Inch Pincher was actually one of the very first cars in the world to run BRM magnesium wheels, the same wheels you'd see on Formula One cars on a VW Bug at a drag strip in California. That's a very EMPI thing to do. If the best wheels in the world were being used in Formula One, why shouldn't they be on a Volkswagen? Joe Vittone didn't see boundaries the way other people did. In this rebuilt form, Dean Lowry won the Street Eliminator class at the 1967 Hot Rod Magazine Championship Drags at Riverside Raceway, running 12.92 seconds at 102 miles per hour, beating a highboy called John's Speed Shop. A guy named David Carl Peters was a kid in the grandstands that day, and later became a motorsports artist, and he painted a piece called Bad Bug that captures exactly what it felt like to watch this car compete. His description of those early years is worth quoting directly. He wrote that all the old dudes would moan and groan whenever the little orange bomb rolled to the starting line, and they would boo and hiss and ultimately cheer on the little menace as time and time again it took the win light. Through the handicap system, the Pincher would get a head start, and if Dean managed to get to third gear before his rival's light went green, then it was all over. Peters was also honest about something else. Hot Rod Magazine called the car everyone's favorite in their captions, but he said it was actually the most hated car in drag racing, because in 1967, hot rodders didn't even consider a Bug to be a real car. So it was hated because it was a Volkswagen, and hated because nobody could beat it. And those two things together made people absolutely crazy. You can imagine the conversations in the pits. Guys who'd spent thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours building their engines getting beaten by what they saw as a glorified lawnmower. The resentment was real. The competition record at major events holds up. At the 1966 NHRA World Finals in Tulsa, the Inch Pincher was matched against Tom Tugnoli's UFO Belvedere funny car in a pairing that was David versus Goliath on an almost comic level. The Beetle had already defeated what EMPI's own newsletter called an assortment of hot racing Fords, Chevys, Plymouths, and mixed breed specials before getting to that matchup. Getty Images has photographs of the car at the 1966 NHRA Division 7 Points Championship at Irwindale Raceway and at the 1970 NHRA World Finals at Dallas. A 1967 Champion Spark Plugs advertisement called it EMPI's Inch Pincher, fastest Volkswagen. The car was famous, not just in VW circles, famous, period. Meanwhile, the broader gasser scene was doing its own spectacular thing. Up in the higher gas classes, the A and B gas supercharged ranks, you had some of the most legendary cars in drag racing history, all competing within a few years of each other. And the Inch Pincher existed in the same ecosystem, even if it was fighting in the lower weight breaks. Stone, Woods, and Cook ran a series of 1941 Willys sedans they called the Swindler, and they were extraordinary in a lot of ways. Fred Stone, Tim Woods, and Doug Cook were actually the first racially integrated team in competitive drag racing. Stone and Woods were black in a sport that was almost entirely white at the time, and they were voted fans' favorite race car of all time in a 2008 NHRA poll. Their Swindler debuted in April 1964 with a blown Chrysler Hemi and became the first gasser to top 150 miles per hour. At the peak of the gasser wars in 1964, they were racing up to 8 times a month. That car now sits in the Wally Park's NHRA Motorsports Museum. Ohio George Montgomery was running a baby blue 1933 Willys and won 8 NHRA national titles between 1959 and 1968, including 4 U.S. Nationals wins. He was ranked 28th on NHRA's top 50 racers of all time. His car is in the Henry Ford Museum. Big John Mazmanian had a candy apple red 1941 Willys, and the feud between his team and Stone, Woods, and Cook was fueled, literally, by competing camshaft sponsors. Ingelcams backed Mazmanian, and Iskicams backed Stone, Woods, and Cook, and the companies were running taunting ads against each other in Drag News magazine, and the whole thing was spectacular theater on top of the actual racing. What all those cars had in common was the nose-high stance that became the defining visual of the gasser era. That raised front end wasn't styling, it was pure function.
Swap out the factory-independent front suspension for a straight I-beam or tubular axle, raise the nose up, and when you launch, the weight transfers back to drive the rear tires into the pavement instead of lifting them. Short wheelbase bodies made it more extreme. The Willys 33 body was the holy grail because it was light and short, and the ladder frame met rulebook requirements. Ford Anglias, Austin sedans, early Chevys, Corvettes, everyone was looking for the body that gave them the best weight-to-displacement number for their engine combination.
The inch pincher was doing the same thing with completely different math. Instead of a 400-plus cubic inch supercharged American V8 shoehorned into a pre-war body, it was a purpose-built 1-liter and change air-cooled German engine in a post-war German body that happened to be both light and aerodynamically decent. The physics worked out differently, but the result was the same, a car that could win in its class. And not just win occasionally, win consistently, win enough to make people angry. Around 1968, something happened that would have a lasting impact on the inch pincher story and on VW performance in general. Dean Lowry left EMPI. He and his brother Ken founded a new company called Dino Dinosaurs Incorporated, based in Santa Ana. And if you've ever seen the Flintstone-style dinosaur logo on vintage VW performance parts, that's what this was. Dino Dinosaurs developed the Ultra Case, an aftermarket crankcase that allowed VW engines to be built up to 3 liters, and created the first set of aftermarket VW cylinder heads specifically designed for drag racing. Both of those were genuinely landmark products for the VW performance world. The company closed in 1972. Ken Lowry passed away sometime in the mid-2010s. Dean Lowry's contributions to VW drag racing are hard to overstate, even though he's less famous than the car he built. With Lowry gone, the inch pincher went back to Daryl Vittone, and Daryl rebuilt it again with a flower power vinyl roof and a later style front end, and an engine bored and stroked to 1952cc, made it to a Porsche transmission, and raced it in the I-gas class where it ran consistently in the low 12-second range. But there was a weight Daryl was carrying that nobody talked about openly. The inch pincher was known everywhere as the car that Dean built. Daryl wanted to prove himself. He wanted to build something that was unambiguously his. So around 1970, Daryl started over completely. He kept the chassis and running gear from the original car, but sold the 1956 oval window body to someone in Mexico City. More on that later. And he selected a 1959 VW sedan as the new platform. Then he chopped the roof by just under 4 inches. That precision matters. Just under 4 inches kept the car 100% class legal, while dramatically lowering the center of gravity and reducing frontal area. The whole thing got EMPI fiberglass doors and deck lids and fenders, and polished BRM wheels and a plexiglass moonroof. The Inch Pincher 2, he spelled it T-O-O, not the number 2, debuted in early 1971 in primer white. Simple EMPI logos on the doors and nothing else. And on its very first run, it set a national record of 12.11 seconds at 111.5 miles per hour. At the 1971 NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona, it clocked 11.98 seconds at 111.1 miles per hour, which was the quickest run of the entire meet, not just in its class, the whole meet. Let that sink in for a second. Every car that showed up to Pomona that weekend, all the big block Chevys, all the Hemis, all the purpose-built race cars, and the quickest elapsed time belonged to a chopped roof Volkswagen Beetle built by a guy who just wanted to prove he could do it himself. That's what Daryl Vittone accomplished with the Inch Pincher 2. After that one race in primer, the car went to a guy named Roland Sanders. Everyone called him Molly, who transformed it into what became one of the most recognizable paint schemes in VW history, an asymmetrical multi-panel design in candy reds, oranges, and blues. The interior got finished in anodized aluminum with a chrome roll bar and hand-stitched upholstery. The engine and transmission were plated in gold cadmium. It was a show car that happened to run 11-second quarter miles. And here's the thing, that combination, a car that could win shows and win races, that was pure EMPI philosophy. Why choose between form and function when you could have both? The engine specs on the Inch Pincher 2 are worth getting into because the technical work here was genuinely sophisticated. The initial setup was an 88mm bore by 82mm stroke bottom end with an SPG roller crank assembly, dual 48 IDA Weber carburetors, an EMPI 851 camshaft, 1.4:1 ratio rocker arms, and 39 by 35.5mm valves in modified VW dual-port heads, making around 170 horsepower in a car that weighed 1,366 pounds. Later, a man named Fumio Fukaya, a legendary head porter who would become Daryl's business partner, upgraded the valve sizes to 42mm by 37.5mm with an Ingle cam. The exhaust was a 1 5/8" header with a chrome 28-inch stinger. The transmission was a Porsche 356 4-speed with a ZF limited slip differential, which was chronically weak for the power going through it. The transmission was always the weak point. You could build the engine to make all the horsepower in the world, but if the transmission couldn't handle it, you were going nowhere. Daryl won the Eliminator class at the 1972 NHRA Winter Nationals in this car, beating competitors including the Lightning Bug and the Underdog. At its best, the Inch Pincher 2 reportedly ran 11.5 seconds at 115 miles per hour at Orange County Raceway. Those are numbers that put it in the conversation with serious muscle cars of the era. Not VW muscle cars, period. The Lightning Bug deserves some time here because the Schley brothers' car was the Inch Pincher's most direct rival, and their story is almost as good. Paul and Mark Schley started racing in 1963 when they were 17 and in high school. Their mother was terrified they'd get into trouble with the muscle car, so they got a VW instead. Paul later explained they chose to race the Volkswagen simply because it was the only car they owned. 3 iterations of the Lightning Bug followed. The second one was actually sponsored by Dean Lowry's Dino Dinosaurs after he left the MPI, which created this ironic situation where Daryl's main rival was being supported by the man who built Daryl's car. The Lightning Bug eventually became the first VW Beetle to run in the 10-second quarter mile. The Schleys later founded Schley Products, making specialty tools for Snap-on, and they maintain a private museum of their racing history. Both cars were at the last race ever held at Lyons Drag Strip. The other VW gassers in this world included the Underdog, built by Ron Fleming and Greg Aronson, who were also pioneers of the California Look streetcar movement. The Underdog actually got destroyed when Fleming put it airborne. He built a second one, which ran until about 1973. There was Bill Clarkson's Iguana, a 1956 Bug that ran 11.9 to 12.1 seconds at over 110 miles per hour. Clarkson said he decided to build it after watching the Inch Pincher at Irwindale because he could not get over how fast it was, just blasting past the Corvette in a heads-up race. The Stuttgart Motors Stud Bug, a car from Lodi, New Jersey called Mother's Worry, the Lil Bugger, which set an NHRA record in 1972 and then hit the wall and got totaled the same day. And then at the extreme end of the spectrum, there was the Dirksen Chrome Bug, a full VW funny car with a nitro-burning Chevy engine that ran 7 seconds flat at 210 miles per hour, and that NHRA itself called one of the most popular and well-remembered funny cars of the era. The Inch Pincher directly inspired all of it. Before Daryl and Dean proved the VW could be genuinely competitive, nobody was building serious VW drag cars. After it, there was a whole community. And that's influence. That's legacy. Not just winning races, but changing what people thought was possible, making them rethink their assumptions about what a Volkswagen could do. Back at EMPI itself, though, things were going wrong. In 1970 or 1971, sources are slightly inconsistent on the exact date, Joe Vittone sold EMPI to a corporation called Filter Dynamics International. FDI had been buying up automotive aftermarket companies across Southern California, and Joe took the deal. He was paid in stocks and shares that proved to be worthless. At its peak, EMPI had been selling $5 to $6 million worth of VW parts per year, with 28 official distributors and 489 agents across America. FDI ran it into the ground, and EMPI closed in 1974. The name eventually got sold to Mr. Gasket and then changed hands again over the decades. A forum member who worked at both Econo Motors and EMPI during the FDI years was blunt about it later. He wrote that FDI was about as crooked as any large corporation can be, and it wasn't a big secret. And if Joe Vittone had done any research on them, he never would have sold. Joe got hosed. That's the polite version. And you can imagine what that felt like. You spend nearly 20 years building a company from nothing, creating a brand that means something, that stands for quality in a market flooded with junk, and you sell it to people who destroy everything you built in less than 4 years. That had to hurt. Daryl left in 1972 to start a new business called The Race Shop with Dave Andrews and Fumio Fukaya. The problem was that when he left, he had to leave the Inch Pincher 2 behind. It was part of the EMPI sale. He walked away from the car he'd built without taking it with him. And that's a detail that clearly stayed with him. The car went to a driver named Jim Carlson and then to subsequent owners, and it never recaptured what it had been under Daryl. What Daryl did next split the VW community. He built a Fiat 850 Spider with a VW engine that ran 10.3 seconds at over 130 miles per hour, which was light years ahead of anything else in its class. Technical triumph. But VW loyalists were furious. You abandoned the bug for a Fiat? One bitter post from years later called it out directly. He could have probably cut a deal with FDI to get titled to the Inch Pinchers and the name, but he didn't want to do that. No, he built a VW-powered Fiat drag car. He alienated thousands of VW fans by running the Fiat. And look, I get both sides of that. From Daryl's perspective, he was an engineer and a racer, and the Fiat platform gave him advantages the Beetle didn't. Lower, lighter, better weight distribution for a mid-engine setup. It made technical sense. But from the fans' perspective, Daryl Vittone was the Inch Pincher guy. He was VW royalty, and switching to a Fiat felt like a betrayal, even if it wasn't intended that way. Perception matters, especially in tight-knit communities like this. Daryl kept going with water-cooled VWs from 1978 onward, and in 1981 founded Tectonics Tuning, which became the longest-lasting water-cooled VW performance tuner in North America. He moved the operation from Southern California to Sheridan, Oregon in 1991. His motto was, "One dyno test is worth 1,000 expert opinions." And that's the engineer talking. That's the guy who trusted data over folklore, who wanted proof instead of guesses. Even after surviving bladder cancer and having his bladder removed, Daryl was racing at Bonneville in a Karmann Ghia with a bored 1200 block hitting over 160 miles per hour. Think about that for a second. Cancer survivor, missing an organ, still out there pushing a Volkswagen to ridiculous speeds on the salt flats. That's dedication. He passed away around 2020. A tribute on VW Vortex called him the one guy responsible for more of us being into VWs than anyone else outside of Volkswagen itself. That's probably right. How many people bought a Beetle or a Rabbit or a GTI because they saw what Daryl Vittone proved was possible? How many kids in the 60s and 70s watched the Inch Pincher win and decided right then that they wanted to build their own VW? You can't quantify that impact, but it's real. Joe Vittone moved to Florida in his later years and became a pilot who built and flew his own aircraft. He passed away in February 2010 at 86 years old. Before that, he'd made it to a Florida Bug Jam event where he sat with Richard Guido and signed autographs on EMPI GTV steering wheels. And people who were there described him as a genuine class act. A man who started by making valve guides and ended up building something that changed an entire subculture of American motorsports. Now the fate of the original cars. This is where the story gets a little melancholy. The first Inch Pincher, Daryl's original 1956 oval window Beetle, had its body sold to someone in Mexico City around 1970 when Daryl was building the two. It's generally believed that car no longer exists. But in March 2014, researchers Dean Kirsten and Paul Schley found something remarkable. In a small town north of Phoenix, Arizona, they located a driver's door from the car's final paint scheme that had been hidden for over 42 years. Just a door, but it was confirmed, and Hot VWs magazine reported on it. That door is all that's left of the original Inch Pincher, the car that started everything, the car that Dan Gurney drove in Nassau, the car that Dean Lowry turned into a drag racing legend. One door sitting in someone's garage in Arizona. That's what remains. The Inch Pincher 2 is even harder to track. After FDI and various owners, its whereabouts became genuinely murky. There are forum posts suggesting it ended up in South America completely disassembled. There's an unconfirmed tip about a wrecking yard in Waco, Texas that nobody ever followed up on publicly. Most historians who've looked at this believe the body no longer exists. Maybe it does. Nobody has proven otherwise. And honestly, that's the sad reality of a lot of these cars. They weren't treated as museum pieces when they were done racing. They were used up, parted out, forgotten. The car that ran 11.98 seconds at the 1971 Winter Nationals, the quickest car at the entire meet, might be rusting in pieces somewhere in South America. Or it might have been crushed decades ago. We just don't know. The Inch Pincher 3, which was an East Coast car campaigned by Richard Guido of Competition Car Parts in New York, actually survived and has a known location. It's in Japan, owned by Flat 4, which is one of the premier VW aftermarket companies in the world. Guido visited the car there after not seeing it for over 30 years. In the early 1990s, Flat 4 also built a faithful clone of the Inch Pincher 2 to accompany the debut of their BRM-type wheel, which tells you something about how seriously the Japanese VW community takes this history. They understand what these cars meant. They understand legacy. Modern tributes keep coming. A builder named Travis Ryder brought an Inch Pincher 4 to SEMA 2024, a right-hand drive 1958 bug in apricot metal flake with a 2500cc engine producing over 200 horsepower. Dragzine covered it and called it one of the best things at the show. An Inch Pincher 8, built by Ola Endler with twin Flat 4 engines, was on the cover of Hot VW's magazine in June 2025. The lineage keeps going. People are still building cars that carry the Inch Pincher name, that honor what Daryl and Dean and Joe created. And that's how you know something mattered. When people are still building tributes 50, 60 years later, that's influence.
The gasser era itself ended for reasons that had nothing to do with the Inch Pincher and everything to do with where motorsports money was pointing. Funny cars offered more spectacle and more factory involvement. Safety concerns were growing about short wheelbase, high center of gravity cars running at speeds they were never designed for. In 1967, NHRA first allowed late-model cars in gas classes, and icons like Ohio George switched to fiberglass Mustang bodies. Pro Stock debuted at the 1970 Winter Nationals, replacing the whole gasser concept with current model production cars. By 1972, NHRA had eliminated separate gas classes entirely. The cars that survived migrated to Competition Eliminator or Superstock, or just sat in garages, slowly becoming history. The gasser wars produced some of the most visually striking and culturally resonant machines in American motorsports. The nose-high stance, the wild paint schemes, the mismatch of pre-war bodies and post-war engines, the backyard engineering, and the shoestring budgets. All of it added up to something that felt genuinely American in a particular way. Creative and stubborn and a little bit chaotic and completely unwilling to accept that the established way of doing things was the only way. The Inch Pincher embodied all of that and then doubled it by being a Volkswagen. The car that hot rodders were supposed to dismiss as a glorified lawnmower engine became the car that embarrassed them at their own game. Dean Lowry figured out how to extract performance from an air-cooled Flat 4 that no one thought was possible, and Daryl Vittone built on that work and made it beautiful. And Joe Vittone created the company that funded all of it and gave it a stage to perform on. Hot Rod Magazine put it at number 53 of all time. The Wally Parks NHRA Motorsports Museum acknowledges EMPI's legacy. Flat 4 in Japan keeps one of the original cars and built a tribute to another. A painting called Bad Bug by David Carl Peters captures the moment a kid in the Riverside grandstands watched the little orange Volkswagen beat everything that pulled up next to it. Travis Ryder showed up at SEMA 2024 honoring the lineage. That's what happens when something is genuinely good. It doesn't need anyone to argue for its place in history. The record does that on its own.